I built a massive logistics empire from a freezing Chicago garage. I survived corporate raiders' market crashes and backstabbing partners. But the most lethal strike of my life did not come from a boardroom. It came while I was fighting for my last breath on a hospital stretcher. I heard the emergency room doctor call my wife of 15 years to tell her I was having a massive heart attack. Her response chilled me faster than the icy fluids entering my veins. She told the doctor to give me a pill because her expensive first-class flights to Hawaii were leaving in hours. If you want to know what happens when a man realizes his wife is leaving him to die for a vacation, listen. I am Richard. I am 70 years old. On a crisp Tuesday morning, I was sitting behind the massive mahogany desk in my corner office overlooking the Chicago skyline. I was reviewing the quarterly projections for the supply chain software company I founded 4 decades ago. Back then, I was just a hungry kid coding in a garage that smelled of motor oil. Now I controlled a logistics network moving billions in freight. But biology does not care about your net worth. It started as a dull ache. I ignored it, chalking it up to the black coffee I had consumed since dawn. Then came the taste of copper in my mouth. Before I could reach for my water, an invisible vice clamped down on my chest. It was an absolute crushing pressure, as if a freight truck had parked directly on my sternum. I tried to stand, but my legs gave out. I collapsed heavily onto the polished wood of my desk, scattering financial reports. I could not draw a breath. The air suddenly felt thick, heavy, unbreathable. My vision narrowed into a dark tunnel. Through the ringing in my ears, I heard my office door swing open. My secretary screamed. Time splintered into fragmented moments. The chaotic blur of faces. Paramedics shouting my vitals. The sharp sting of a needle entering my arm. The violent jolt of the stretcher hitting the ambulance floor. Through it all, I remained conscious enough to understand the gravity of the situation. I calculated risks for a living, and the statistics of surviving what felt like my heart ripping itself apart were not in my favor. The sirens wailed a frantic soundtrack to the panic coursing through my fading mind. I had spent my entire life building an empire, securing my legacy, providing a life of luxury for my family, my wife Cynthia, my stepson Brandon. I had given them the world. As the ambulance tore through the streets, a sense of comfort washed over me. I thought at least I will be surrounded by my family. I could not have been more wrong. The emergency room at City General was a symphony of controlled chaos. Bright fluorescent lights stabbed at my eyes. Nurses moved around me with urgent precision, attaching electrodes to my chest, calling out numbers that clearly alarmed them. I lay there staring at the ceiling tiles, my breathing shallow and ragged. The crushing weight on my chest had subsided slightly thanks to the drugs, but I knew I was dancing on the edge of the abyss. The attending physician, a young man with tired eyes, leaned over me. He told me I was experiencing a severe myocardial infarction. He needed to stabilize me before moving me to the cardiac intensive care unit. He asked for my emergency contact. I whispered Cynthia's name and gave him her number. I pictured her in our suburban mansion, dropping whatever she was doing, rushing out the door in tears. I had treated her son Brandon as my own, placing him as the chief operating officer of my company. They were my world. The doctor dialed the number on his mobile phone and put it on speaker so I could hear her voice, hoping it would bring me comfort. It rang 3 times before she answered. There was background noise, the sound of zippers closing, luggage wheels rolling across hardwood floors. "Hello," Cynthia answered. Her tone was brisk, hurried. "Mrs. Cynthia," the doctor said, his voice calm and steady. "I am calling from City General Hospital. I am here with your husband, Richard. He has suffered a severe heart attack. We are working to stabilize him now, but his condition is critical. We need you to come to the hospital immediately." I waited for the gasp. I waited for the panicked questions. I waited for the sound of my wife dropping everything. Instead, there was a long, heavy pause, then a sigh of pure, unadulterated annoyance. "Is this some kind of joke?" Cynthia said. Her voice was cold, sharp, and completely devoid of empathy. "Madam, please, I assure you this is not a joke," the doctor replied, clearly taken aback. "Your husband is in critical condition. He needs his family." I heard the sound of a suitcase zipping shut on the other end of the line. "I cannot come to the hospital right now," she snapped. "Brandon and Tiffany have been packing for weeks. We are leaving for the airport in 2 hours. Our first-class flights to Maui are entirely non-refundable." The doctor glanced down at me, his eyes wide with disbelief. I lay paralyzed, copper returning to my mouth. "Mrs. Cynthia, your husband might not survive the night," the doctor said. "You need to be here." "Just give him a pill, doctor," Cynthia replied indifferently. "He is a tough old man. He can manage. I am not ruining my vacation over this. We have a private yacht booked for tomorrow. Tell Richard to call me when he is discharged. Have a good day." The line went dead. The silence in the trauma bay was deafening. The doctor slowly lowered his phone, staring at it, as if it had turned into a venomous snake. He looked at me, struggling to find words of comfort. But no words could fix what had just happened. My heart monitor began to beep wildly, the tempo accelerating into a frantic rhythm. The alarms on the machines around me blared. It was not just the physical damage to my heart anymore. It was the absolute crushing realization that the woman I had showered with millions of dollars had just weighed my life against a vacation to Hawaii and chose the vacation. She was leaving me to die alone in a sterile room, so she would not miss her flight. The nurses rushed back in, pushing medications through my line, shouting for the crash cart. My vision started to fade to black, but my mind was screaming. I realized then that they did not love me. They loved my bank accounts. They loved the luxury I provided. I was nothing but an infinite wallet to them. As the darkness pulled me under, the grief and betrayal evaporated. In its place, a cold, calculating rage ignited in my chest. I swore a silent oath to myself in that fading moment. If I survive this single night, Cynthia will return from her tropical paradise to find absolutely nothing left. The sterile air of this intensive care unit was heavy with the scent of antiseptic and dying hope. I lay there, tubes snaking from my arms, my chest still throbbing with the ghost of that crushing weight. The heavy steel door creaked open, and in walked Cynthia and Brandon. They were a jarring sight against the backdrop of medical monitors and beeping machines. Cynthia looked like she had just stepped off a yacht. Her hair was styled in a perfect, expensive blowout, and she clutched a brand new Hermes bag that cost more than my first car. Brandon was right behind her, his tailored Italian suit jacket sharp and unwrinkled. He looked more like a man heading to a board meeting than a stepson visiting a father who had nearly died the night before. I closed my eyes for a second, trying to steady my heart rate. When I opened them, Cynthia was hovering over my bedside. She leaned in, her perfume, a sharp floral scent clashing with the hospital's medicinal smell. "Richard, honey," she said, her voice dripping with artificial warmth. She placed a manicured hand on my arm, but her touch felt cold. "The doctor says the worst is over. You look so much better than you did last night." I did not answer. I just watched her. I wanted to see if there was any real fear in her eyes, any lingering trace of the woman who had shared my bed for 15 years. All I saw was impatience. She kept glancing at her watch, the gold links glinting under the harsh overhead lights. Brandon moved to the foot of my bed, folding his arms across his chest. He looked at the monitors, then back at me, with an expression that was supposed to be concern, but looked more like a calculation. "Me staying here will just stress you out." Cynthia continued, her tone shifting to that familiar, sugary sweet register she used when she wanted to manipulate me. "I know you, Richard. You hate being seen in this state. You want everyone to be strong, to be productive." She patted my hand, then pulled it away quickly, as if she had touched something dirty. "Brandon needs this Hawaii trip to decompress. Running your company has been exhausting for him. He has been taking on so much responsibility lately. You want us to be happy, right? You want to know that we are out there enjoying the fruits of your hard work while you recover." I nodded slowly, keeping my face slack. It was the easiest performance of my life. I played the role of the frail, dependent old man who was grateful for his family's presence. Inside, I was reading them like a profit and loss statement. They were not here to comfort me. They were here to ensure I would not interfere with their schedule. They were here because they needed to clear the path for their departure. I took a deep breath, feeling the mechanical whine of the ventilator nearby. Yes, I managed to whisper, my voice raspy and thin. You should go. I do not want to hold you back. A look of relief passed between them. It was subtle, almost invisible, but I saw it. Cynthia's shoulders dropped, and Brandon's face brightened. See, I told you, Brandon said, flashing that crooked grin I once mistook for sincerity. Dad knows the value of hard work. He knows we cannot just pause the world because of one bad day. I looked at my stepson. For years, I had treated Brandon as if he were my own blood. I had guided him, mentored him, and handed him the keys to the kingdom I had built with my bare hands. I had trusted him when I should have been watching his moves. Now, watching him stand at the foot of my bed, I realized he had been waiting for this moment. He was not waiting for my recovery. He was waiting for my vacancy. The office, the assets, the power, he saw them as his inheritance, and he was tired of waiting for me to step aside. Cynthia began to fuss with the collar of my hospital gown, a gesture that meant nothing. She was just keeping up appearances for the nurse passing by the door. You rest, she instructed, her voice regaining that authoritative edge. We have everything under control at the office. Brandon has already reorganized the morning schedule. You do not have to worry about a single thing. Just focus on your heart. Just focus on your health. We will call you from the airport. I watched her turn to the mirror on the wall, checking her lipstick, adjusting a stray hair. She had no intention of staying a minute longer than necessary. The hospital was a place of sickness, and Cynthia hated anything that reminded her of reality. She lived in a bubble of luxury, and I was starting to become a stain on that bubble. Brandon took a step toward me. The jovial expression shifted, becoming more professional, more transactional. He reached into his suit jacket and pulled out a thick stack of legal papers. The paper was thick, expensive, the kind that held weight. It felt heavy even from where I lay. He pulled a fountain pen from his pocket, the gold nib glinting in the light. Dad, just one quick thing before we head to the airport, he said. It is just the standard medical and financial power of attorney. We need it so we can sign the new vendor contracts and keep the payroll moving while you are stuck in this bed. It is a formality. We have already gone over the details with the legal team. They just need your signature to keep things running. I stared at the papers. My pulse raced to the machine beside me, picking up the pace. This was it. The move. The play to take the keys while I was still bleeding out. They were not asking. They were finalizing. I looked at Brandon, then at the papers, and for a fleeting moment I almost laughed. They were so confident, so utterly sure of my demise that they did not even bother to hide their true colors. I shifted in the bed, groaning as if the pain were too much to bear, my hands fumbling weakly as I reached for the pen. I was the clueless old man they wanted, and I would play that part until the very last second. I recalled the early days in the garage, the smell of grease and ambition, the cold concrete floor beneath my sleeping bag because I was too broke for an apartment. I remembered the nights I skipped meals so I could afford that first server. I worked for every single dollar, every inch of ground I gained in this city. And now my own blood, or what I had called my blood, was treating those decades of sacrifice as a pile of loose change. My hands moved slowly, deliberately towards the pen. The air in the room felt tight, pressing against my temples, but my focus remained absolute. This was a game of shadows, and I was the one holding the lantern. Brandon stepped closer to the bed, his expensive designer cologne barely masking the sterile hospital smell. He smoothed out the thick legal pages against the plastic tray table that hovered over my lap. It is nothing major, Dad, he said, his voice maintaining that carefully rehearsed corporate calm. Just a standard medical and financial power of attorney. With you stuck in here for the foreseeable future, I need the legal authority to sign the vendor contracts and authorize the bi-weekly payroll. The banks are getting strict about these things. We cannot afford any operational delays while you recover. You know exactly how the board gets when cash flow stalls. I forced my eyes to squint, playing the part of a man whose brain was clouded by morphine and profound fatigue. But 40 years of building a logistics empire from scratch does not just vanish because of a blocked artery. My mind was sharp, evaluating every syllable he spoke. I looked down at the documents. The font was small, the legal jargon dense, exactly the kind of paperwork meant to overwhelm a dying man. But I did not need to read every single line to spot the trap. My eyes caught a specific clause buried on the second page. Total liquidation rights. It was a phrase that had no business being in a temporary operational proxy. He was not asking for permission to pay our employees. He was asking for the legal right to sell my assets, empty my accounts, and completely liquidate the company I had painstakingly built. I shifted my gaze from the paperwork back to my stepson. I looked at his hands. For all his smooth talking and tailored suits, Brandon was still an amateur playing in a high-stakes arena. His left hand, resting on the edge of the plastic tray, was trembling. It was a slight, almost imperceptible tremor, but to a man who had negotiated with ruthless corporate raiders, it was a glaring siren. A drop of sweat had pooled at his temple despite the freezing air conditioning of the intensive care unit. He was terrified. He knew exactly what he was attempting to steal, and he was absolutely terrified I would read the fine print before the ink hit the page. I let out a ragged cough, letting my head loll back against the thin hospital pillow. The heart monitor beeped in a steady, reassuring rhythm, a stark contrast to the betrayal unfolding beside my bed. "Oh, Brandon," I mumbled, slurring my words slightly to sell the performance. "You know I cannot focus on all this dense legal text right now. Just tell me where to sign so you can catch your flight." Cynthia stepped up beside him, her impatience radiating like heat. "Just sign it, Richard," she urged, tapping her expensive shoe against the linoleum floor. "We really are going to miss the boarding call, and the traffic to the airport is going to be an absolute nightmare today." Her complete disregard for my life was breathtaking. Brandon uncapped his gold fountain pen and pressed it into my weak hand. He pointed to the dotted line at the bottom of the final page. "Right here, Dad," he instructed softly, "and initial here on the second page." I gripped the cold metal of the pen. My fingers felt stiff, but my mind was operating with crystal clarity. I had signed my name tens of thousands of times over the last 4 decades. Contracts, mergers, acquisitions, and brutal lawsuits. My signature was a brand. It had a very specific aggressive loop on the capital R, a flourish, that every bank, every attorney, and every board member knew instinctively. It was the unmistakable mark of a man who owned everything he touched. But today, I was not going to be that man. I let my hand shake violently as the nib touched the heavy paper. I dragged the pen across the dotted line, crafting a jagged, sloppy scrawl. I intentionally broke the rhythm, completely omitting the signature loop. I made the letters look exactly like the desperate scribbles of a man whose brain was deprived of oxygen. It was a deliberate, undeniable forgery of my own name. Any competent forensic auditor or restructuring lawyer would spot the discrepancy immediately. My personal wealth attorney would take one single look at that document and have it legally invalidated in 5 minutes. Brandon snatched the paper the second the pen lifted from the page. He did not even bother to check the quality of the signature. He just saw the wet ink and let out a long, shuddering breath of relief. He quickly shoved the thick stack of papers back into his suit jacket, buttoning it up to secure his stolen prize. "Thank you, Dad," he said, his voice instantly regaining its arrogant, confident edge. "This is going to make everything so much easier for everyone. You just focus on resting and letting the doctors do their jobs." Cynthia leaned down and pressed a dry, mechanical kiss to my forehead. She did not even try to look me in the eyes. "Call us when they move you out of intensive care," she said, already turning toward the door. We will send you some pictures from the beach. Try not to stress the nurses out too much. We need to leave before the afternoon rush hour begins, or we will miss our flight entirely." I simply nodded, watching her walk away. Without another word, they turned and walked out of the trauma bay. The heavy steel door clicked shut behind them, sealing me inside the sterile room. I listened closely to the sound of Cynthia's designer heels clicking down the long hospital hallway, fading away slowly until there was absolutely nothing left but the constant rhythmic hum of the medical equipment. I stared at the blank ceiling. For 10 full seconds, I remained perfectly still. I waited until I was absolutely certain they were out of the building and gone for good. Then the facade dropped. The frail, confused old man vanished into thin air. I sat up straight, ignoring the dull ache radiating through my chest. I reached up and ripped the secondary oxygen monitor off my finger. I pulled the adhesive nodes of the backup heart monitor from my collarbone. The machine let out a brief warning chirp, but I quickly silenced it by hitting the override button on the side panel. I swung my legs over the edge of the bed. My breathing was surprisingly steady. My vision was perfectly clear. I reached into the personal belongings bag the nurses had placed in the bedside cabinet and pulled out my tablet. They thought they had secured their massive fortune. They thought they were leaving a dead man behind to rot. But they had just handed a loaded weapon to a veteran street fighter. I unlocked the screen, the bright glow illuminating the dark hospital room. It was time to finally hunt down the people who betrayed me. My fingers hovered over the glass screen of the tablet. I bypassed the standard biometric security locks and accessed the master portal for our joint banking accounts. The hospital wireless network was incredibly slow, agonizingly sluggish, but the spinning loading wheel gave me a few necessary seconds to brace my mind. I had spent 15 years building a flawless financial fortress to ensure my wife would never have to worry about money. I had gladly given her a platinum card with absolutely no limit, completely assuming she would always use it with the grace and respect that accompanied our privileged life together. Now I was logging in to see exactly how quickly a supposedly grieving widow could spend her dying husband's cash. The main dashboard finally loaded, displaying a cascading list of recent transactions. I tapped directly on the primary credit account linked specifically to Cynthia. I genuinely expected to see the first-class flight upgrades she had mentioned on the phone. I expected to see the luxury resort reservations that were allegedly non-refundable. I was even prepared to see a few overpriced airport meals and expensive cocktails. What I was absolutely not prepared for was the precise, undeniable timeline of her lavish spending spree. I carefully scanned the digital timestamps aligned on the left side of the screen. My chest tightened instantly, not from a blocked coronary artery, but from a profound, sickening realization of betrayal. Exactly 2 hours after the emergency paramedics had wheeled my lifeless body out of my corporate office, and exactly 2 hours after she received the frantic telephone call from the emergency room doctor telling her I was in critical condition, my loving wife had gone shopping. There it was, sitting proudly at the top of the digital ledger in stark black and white. A pending charge for $15,000 at a Louis Vuitton boutique located directly inside the international terminal of the airport. $15,000. While I was taking my first shallow, painful breaths under a plastic oxygen mask, fighting for every single heartbeat in a sterile trauma bay, Cynthia was casually swiping her card for designer luggage and expensive leather handbags. My eyes slowly moved down to the very next transaction on the list. It had been officially processed just 30 minutes after the boutique purchase. $12,000 paid directly to an exclusive private yacht charter company based on the coast of Maui. I stared at the numbers until my vision literally blurred. This was not a relaxing vacation to decompress. This was not a necessary trip to escape the emotional stress of my severe medical emergency. This was a victory lap. They were actively celebrating. My wife and my stepson were already spending their anticipated inheritance popping expensive champagne on my metaphorical grave before the dirt had even been shoveled. I felt a cold, sharp clarity wash over my entire mind, instantly burning away any residual affection I ever held for the woman who had shared my home for 15 years. She was a greedy parasite, and Brandon was her willing, calculating accomplice. But parasites can only drain you if you intentionally leave the host body exposed and vulnerable. I calmly closed the personal checking portal and navigated to the secure corporate ledger for my logistics software company. I desperately needed to see exactly how much structural damage Brandon had caused while masquerading as the chief operating officer of my empire. If he had boldly pushed me to sign a document containing a total liquidation clause, he was not just looking to legally sign payroll checks for our employees. He was actively preparing to drain the business dry. I tapped on the outgoing wire transfers tab, deliberately sorting the detailed list by the last 48 hours. My eyes darted past the standard monthly vendor payments, the routine utility bills, and the regular software licensing renewals. Everything looked perfectly normal and completely mundane until I reached the very bottom of the digital page. A massive, glaring anomaly sat right there in the pending outbound queue, waiting to be cleared by the bank. It was a prioritized wire transfer for exactly $50,000 pulled directly from our primary corporate operating account. I narrowed my eyes, tapping on the transaction to expand the recipient details. The funds were absolutely not going to a reliable logistics partner or a standard server hardware manufacturer. The massive sum of money was specifically wired as a non-refundable retainer fee to Vanguard and Hayes. My blood ran cold at the sight of that name. Vanguard and Hayes was one of the most ruthless, aggressive corporate restructuring law firms in the entire city of Chicago. They were absolute sharks, the exact kind of high-powered lawyers you only ever hire when you are actively planning a hostile corporate takeover, a forced bankruptcy declaration, or a massive immediate liquidation of company assets. My analytical mind raced rapidly, connecting the dark dots with lethal, unforgiving precision. Brandon was not a visionary entrepreneur. He did not possess the strategic vision, the raw intelligence, or the fundamental grit required to build a successful company from nothing. He only knew how to dismantle and sell what I had already painstakingly created. But the burning question remained. Why would my seemingly loyal chief operating officer quietly hire brutal corporate liquidators while I was still technically drawing breath in a hospital intensive care unit? The timing was too perfect, too maliciously calculated. He knew about my declining health before the heart attack even happened, or he was simply ready to execute a hostile plan the very second I showed physical weakness. He was moving pieces on a chessboard while I was lying in a hospital bed attached to life support machines. The sheer audacity of his secret action was staggering. He was utilizing my own corporate funds to legally orchestrate my permanent removal from the logistics empire I built from a freezing garage. I needed a verified pair of eyes on the inside immediately. I needed a trusted ally who could safely navigate the corporate servers and see the hidden shadows Brandon was casting across my own building. I minimized the banking application and opened my securely encrypted contact list. I scrolled past the useless business acquaintances and fake corporate friends until I found the only name that truly mattered right now. Sarah Jenkins. She was my brilliant, fiercely loyal chief financial officer. She had been standing right beside me since the early days, back when we could barely afford to pay the monthly heating bill. She knew every single financial secret of my company, and she absolutely despised Brandon's arrogant, entitled behavior. I stared at her name on the glowing screen, fully aware that making this telephone call would officially initiate a devastating corporate war. I took one final deep breath of the sterile hospital air, letting the cold reality of my situation settle deep into my bones. There was absolutely no turning back now. The illusion of my happy, loving family had been completely shattered permanently replaced by a greedy syndicate of thieves waiting for my heart to stop beating. I pressed the green call button. I waited. The line rang once, twice. On the third ring, the connection clicked open, followed immediately by the sound of shuffling papers and a sharp exhale. Richard. Sarah answered, her voice tight with an anxiety she rarely displayed. The hospital called the main office. They said you had a massive coronary incident. I was grabbing my coat to drive down there right now. How are you even speaking to me? Should you be on a phone, Sarah? Listen to me very carefully, I said, keeping my voice low and completely devoid of the panic she was projecting. I do not have time for medical updates, and you do not have time to drive to this hospital. I need you sitting exactly where you are, behind your desk, logged into the primary secure terminal. There was a brief, stunned silence on the other end of the line. Sarah Jenkins had been my chief financial officer for nearly 15 years, but her loyalty stretched back much further. She was my first real hire back when the logistics empire was nothing more than 3 refurbished desktop computers humming in a freezing Chicago garage. She had stood by me through brutal market crashes, ruthless corporate raiders, and weeks where we barely managed to scrape together enough cash to keep the server farm running. She knew my tone. She knew that when my voice dropped an octave and the emotion vanished, we were going to war. I am at my desk, Sarah confirmed, her professional instincts instantly overriding her personal concern. Tell me what you need. Brandon has locked me out of the master executive suite, I explained, staring at the sterile white tiles above my hospital bed. He just visited me here in the intensive care unit and aggressively pushed a full medical and financial power of attorney into my hands. He claimed he needed it to authorize standard vendor payments while I recover. But I just checked our outgoing corporate wire queue. Your beloved chief operating officer just forwarded a $50,000 non-refundable retainer fee to Vanguard and Hayes. I heard Sarah draw in a sharp, ragged breath. Even in the finance department, the name Vanguard and Hayes was universally recognized as the absolute grim reaper of corporate restructuring. That makes absolutely no sense, Sarah whispered, the rapid typing on her keyboard echoing through the phone receiver. Brandon does not have the unilateral authority to hire external liquidation counsel, and he certainly does not have the operating budget clearance to issue a $50,000 retainer without my direct verified countersignature. He does if he assumes I am going to be dead before tomorrow morning, I replied coldly. He and his mother are currently sitting in the first-class lounge at the airport, waiting to board a flight to Maui. They think they have officially secured the keys to the entire kingdom. I need you to bypass the new administrative firewalls Brandon installed just last month. I need you to dig deeply into the shadow ledgers and find out exactly what financial data he has been sending to those restructuring lawyers. Richard, if I bypass his specific executive firewalls, his monitoring software will flag my terminal, Sarah warned. He will know someone is digging through his private directories. Let him know, I stated firmly. I gave that boy absolutely everything he could ever dream of. I handed him a corner office with a panoramic view of the skyline. I gave him a bloated 6-figure salary that he never earned. I paid for his luxury vehicles, his custom-tailored suits, and his exclusive country club memberships. I dressed him up and allowed him to play the role of a brilliant chief operating officer purely out of blind love for his mother. I wanted to believe that if I gave him the world, he would eventually learn how to carry the heavy weight of it. Instead, he just learned how to steal it. He has always been a parasite, Richard, Sarah said, her voice dropping into a dangerous, protective whisper. We both knew he lacked the grit to actually build anything of value. Give me 20 minutes. I am going to rip his personal servers wide open. The secure line went silent. I lowered the tablet to my chest and closed my eyes, letting the mechanical hum of the intensive care unit wash over me. My physical heart was severely damaged, heavily bruised and beating with a painful, irregular rhythm, but my mind had never been more focused. The sheer audacity of Brandon's absolute betrayal fueled my adrenaline. He genuinely believed that a fancy title and a forged document were enough to dismantle a massive logistics empire. He was about to learn a very painful lesson regarding the fundamental difference between an entitled heir and a ruthless founder. The minutes stretched on with agonizing slowness. A young nurse quietly entered the room to check my intravenous fluid lines, casting a suspicious glance at the glowing tablet resting on my lap. I simply offered her a weak, tired smile, playing the role of the exhausted patient, until she turned around and walked back out into the bright, loud hallway. I calculated every possible scenario in my head, visualizing the corporate battlefield. Brandon was arrogant, but he was also incredibly careless. He always left a trail of sloppy mistakes because he never truly understood the complex machinery of the software network he was supposedly managing. I knew that Sarah would find the smoking gun. Exactly 20 minutes later, my private secure line buzzed. I answered it immediately. "Sarah," I said, "what did you find?" I could hear the trembling in her breath before she even spoke a single word. The steady, reliable chief financial officer who had fearlessly negotiated multi-million-dollar mergers without breaking a sweat was currently shaking. Richard, Sarah began, her voice cracking under the immense weight of her discovery. Brandon is not just hiring restructuring lawyers to reorganize the vendor payrolls. I finally broke through his encrypted personal folders and found a hidden directory containing months of highly confidential internal communications. "Tell me exactly what you are looking at." I commanded, my grip tightening around the cold, metallic edge of the hospital bed railing. "He has been secretly funneling our proprietary source code, our primary client databases, and our entire 5-year financial projection portfolio to an aggressive venture capital firm based out of New York." Sarah explained, the sound of her frantic scrolling filling the quiet room. "He has deliberately bypassed our internal legal department and engaged Vanguard and Hayes to aggressively expedite the due diligence process. He is using that new power of attorney document to bypass your mandatory shareholder approval." She paused, letting the devastating reality of the situation settle between us in the cold silence. The oxygen machine hummed loudly beside my bed, a stark reminder of my vulnerability. But the weakness in my physical body was instantly replaced by a burning, unyielding resolve. "Richard," Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible over the sterile noise of the busy intensive care unit. "Brandon is not just running payroll. I found the emails. He is selling the entire company. Selling the company." I repeated the words, tasting like ash in my mouth. My voice was completely flat. The heart monitor beside my bed maintained its steady, rhythmic pulse, betraying none of the absolute fury igniting in my veins. I instructed Sarah to print every single document, every email thread, and every hidden contract she had managed to excavate from his server. I told her to put it all on physical paper. Digital files could be wiped remotely, but physical ink was permanent. I told her to bring the documents to the intensive care unit immediately, but she needed a cover story. Brandon had undoubtedly left strict instructions with the nursing staff regarding my visitors. Sarah understood perfectly. Exactly. 45 minutes later, the heavy door to my hospital room swung open. Sarah walked in. She was carrying a massive, ostentatious gift basket wrapped in bright yellow cellophane and stuffed with exotic fruits. To any passing doctor or nurse, she was merely a concerned corporate colleague delivering a standard get-well-soon present. But as she set the heavy basket down on the rolling tray table over my lap, her eyes met mine. They were fierce, filled with the same unyielding grit that had helped us build a logistics empire from a freezing concrete floor. She pulled a hidden zipper at the bottom of the woven basket and extracted a thick manila folder. She slid it smoothly under my hospital blanket. "The nurses think I am just here to drop this off and say a quick prayer," Sarah whispered, glancing nervously at the small glass window of my room. "You have about 10 minutes before they come back to check your intravenous lines. Read fast, Richard. It is worse than we could have ever imagined." I nodded, waiting for her to step back out into the hallway to stand guard. Once the door clicked shut, I pulled the heavy folder from beneath the thin cotton blanket. My fingers were slightly numb from the medication, but my mind operated with lethal precision. I opened the cover. The very first document was a formal letter of intent from a prominent New York venture capital firm. They were absolute corporate vultures, legendary for buying vulnerable tech companies, stripping their assets, and firing the staff to maximize short-term profits. I read the numbers. Brandon had agreed to sell 30% of my software empire at a humiliatingly deep discount. He was giving away our proprietary supply chain algorithms for a fraction of their true market value. And the timeline was completely devastating. The final execution date was set for this coming Monday morning. I flipped to the next page, my breathing remaining slow and measured. The mechanics of his betrayal were laid out in stark black and white ink. Brandon had quietly negotiated this entire deal over the past 4 months. He used his position as chief operating officer to isolate the legal department, feeding them fabricated projections to justify a search for outside liquidity. But he had always faced one insurmountable hurdle. He did not possess the ultimate executive authority to sign away equity. That power rested exclusively with me. Unless, of course, I was legally incapacitated or dead. I stared at an email thread between Brandon and the lead partner at Vanguard and Hayes. Brandon guaranteed that a full medical and financial power of attorney would be secured by the end of the week. He promised the lawyers the document would grant him total liquidation rights, bypassing standard shareholder approval. He had orchestrated this entire sequence of events perfectly. He just needed my heart to fail. When it finally did, he and his mother wasted absolutely no time. They secured the signature, packed their designer luggage, and boarded a flight to Hawaii, leaving the vultures to feast on the remains of my work. I continued to turn the pages, the cold reality of my situation settling deeply into my chest. The financial documents were infuriating, but they were simply business. The final document in the folder, however, was something entirely different. It was a printed copy of a forwarded email. Brandon had sent it to his wife Tiffany directly from his personal phone just hours before they left for the airport. The subject line was blank. I read his message carefully. The words were burned into my memory instantly. He wrote, "The lawyers are ready for Monday. Once the old man croaks, the holding company automatically defaults to mom. We take our 30% cash out, let the venture guys strip the remaining assets, and he dies a forgotten footnote. Start looking at those properties in the Hamptons. We are finally free. He dies a forgotten footnote." I read that single sentence 3 times. For 15 years, I provided this boy with a life of absolute privilege. I paid for his education, handed him a career, and treated him with respect. And in return, he viewed my impending death as a convenient financial transaction. He did not just want my money. He wanted to erase my legacy completely. He wanted to take the empire I built through blood, sweat, and sacrifice and trade it for a vacation home and a quick payout. I closed the folder and rested my hands on top of it. A normal man might have broken down. A normal man might have wept at the sheer cruelty of his own family. A normal man might have pressed the call button, begging for sedatives to dull the emotional pain. But I did not cry. My heart monitor did not spike. My breathing did not hitch. Instead, staring at the sterile wall, I smiled. It was a cold, quiet, terrifying smile. Brandon had made a fatal miscalculation. He had assumed that because I was 70 years old and lying in a hospital bed, I was weak. He had assumed that a piece of paper signed with shaky ink was enough to topple a king. He had severely underestimated the kind of monster you have to become to build an empire from a freezing garage in Chicago. I slipped the folder back under my blanket just as the heavy door swung open. Sarah stepped back inside, followed closely by a young nurse checking her clipboard. I let my smile fade, replacing it instantly with the mask of a tired, broken old man. The nurse adjusted my intravenous drip, smiled sympathetically at Sarah, and quietly left the room. Sarah rushed to my bedside, her eyes wide with concern and fear. "Richard," she whispered urgently. "What are we going to do?" "He is going to sign those final papers on Monday morning. If that venture capital firm gets their hands on our source code, we are completely finished. I looked at my brilliant chief financial officer. My voice was steady, dropping into a tone she had not heard from me since our most brutal corporate battles a decade ago. "Sarah, my friend," I said calmly, "call Harrison Cole. Tell him to use the freight elevator and bypass the front desk. I want him sitting in this room in exactly 1 hour. We have a company to save and a family to destroy." The heavy wooden door to my hospital room remained closed. I lay perfectly still against the stiff mattress, watching the second hand sweep across the large wall clock. Exactly 58 minutes had passed since my conversation with Sarah. The intensive care unit was deceptively quiet, a stark contrast to the absolute warfare currently brewing inside my mind. Suddenly, the handle clicked. The door did not swing wide open like it did when the nurses entered for their rounds. It opened just enough for a tall, impeccably dressed man to slip through the narrow gap. Harrison Cole had arrived. He brushed a speck of invisible dust from the lapel of his charcoal suit and locked the door behind him. Harrison was 50 years old, sharp as a scalpel, and utterly devoid of professional mercy. He was my personal wealth attorney, a man who charged $2,000 an hour to make rich men impenetrable. I had explicitly instructed Sarah to tell him to use the underground freight elevator and navigate through the basement utility corridors. I needed his arrival to remain completely undocumented by the main hospital lobby security cameras. If Brandon had placed anyone on the payroll to monitor my visitors, I could not risk them spotting the city's most feared wealth protector walking into my room. Harrison approached the foot of my bed, his eyes scanning the medical monitors before finally resting on my face. "You look remarkably alert for a man who officially died for 90 seconds. Yesterday morning," he stated, his voice a low, gravelly baritone that commanded instant authority. I let out a dry, humorless breath. "Death is surprisingly motivating, Harrison." I reached beneath my thin hospital blanket and pulled out the thick manila folder Sarah had smuggled inside the fruit basket. I tossed it onto the plastic tray table. "I need you to read this immediately," I commanded. Every single page. Harrison did not ask any useless questions. He pulled a pair of reading glasses from his breast pocket, dragged a plastic visitor chair to the side of my bed, and opened the folder. I watched his face closely as he reviewed the digital blood trail. For a man who made a lucrative living navigating high-stakes corporate divorces and vicious hostile takeovers, Harrison rarely showed genuine surprise. But as his eyes scanned the credit card statements showing Cynthia swiping her platinum card for $15,000 worth of designer luggage and $12,000 for a private Maui yacht charter, his jaw visibly tightened. He turned the page, moving on to the corporate ledger Sarah had extracted. I saw his eyebrows rise a fraction of an inch when he registered the $50,000 non-refundable retainer fee wired directly from my operating account to Vanguard and Hayes. Finally, he reached the printed emails. He read Brandon's arrogant declaration of his impending corporate sale, the secret negotiations with the New York venture capital firm, and the ultimate damning message sent to Tiffany. He read the line where Brandon referred to my death as a convenient footnote. Harrison closed the thick folder and slowly took off his glasses, folding the arms with a sharp metallic click. The silence in the room was absolute, broken only by the rhythmic beeping of my heart monitor. "I have dealt with some truly despicable human beings in my career," Richard Harrison said, his voice laced with a cold professional disgust. "I have seen brothers steal from brothers and children bankrupt their own parents. But the sheer velocity of this betrayal is staggering. They are actively looting your personal estate before your body has even had a chance to grow cold." I nodded slowly, staring at the blank television screen mounted on the wall. "Brandon also paid me a visit before his flight to Hawaii," I explained quietly. "He brought a full medical and financial power of attorney. He told me it was just to authorize vendor payments and keep the payroll moving while I was stuck in this bed. I knew exactly what it really was. He needs that specific document to legally bypass the mandatory shareholder approval and finalize the software company sale on Monday morning. Harrison leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. Tell me you did not sign that document, Richard. Tell me you did not hand that boy the loaded gun he needs to execute this deal. I looked directly into my attorney's eyes. I signed it, I replied. Harrison let out a sharp sigh of frustration, running a hand over his face. Richard, if you legally granted him that authority, we are going to have to file an emergency injunction to freeze the sale. We will have to argue that you were heavily medicated and not of sound mind. It will be a massive public legal battle. I raised my hand to stop his rising panic. I signed it. I repeated smoothly, but I did not use my actual signature. I crafted a deliberate, jagged forgery. I completely omitted the distinctive loop on the capital letter R. I made it look exactly like the desperate, uncoordinated scribble of an old man suffering from profound oxygen deprivation and powerful narcotics. I handed him a completely invalid piece of paper, and he was so terrified and eager to steal my empire that he snatched it away without even verifying the ink. Harrison paused, processing the tactical brilliance of the move. A slow, predatory smile spread across his face. He leaned back in the plastic chair, shaking his head in sheer disbelief. You gave him a defective grenade, he murmured. The moment Vanguard and Hayes attempt to submit that power of attorney to the bank or the venture capital firm, their own compliance officers will flag the signature discrepancy. We can legally invalidate the entire proxy in less than 5 minutes. It is a brilliant defensive play, Richard. We can stop the corporate sale on Monday morning and immediately strip Brandon of his Chief Operating Officer title. I shook my head, gripping the edge of the blanket tightly. You are not listening to me, Harrison. I do not want to play defense. Stopping the sale is merely a temporary bandage. If we just invalidate the document and fire him, he will spin a lie. He will tell the board he was trying to save the company while I was incapacitated. Cynthia will claim the yacht was just a preemptive memorial gathering. They will hire their own aggressive legal counsel, demand massive severance packages, file for a highly publicized divorce, and attempt to drag my reputation through the mud for the next 3 years. I will not allow them to dictate the terms of this war. I want complete and total annihilation. I want you to prepare the legal framework to quietly transfer all liquid assets into a blind trust by Sunday night. I want the credit cards completely severed. Harrison narrowed his eyes, analyzing the full scope of the requested destruction. If we pull this trigger, Richard Cynthia will be left with absolutely nothing. Are you prepared for that? I looked at my attorney, my heart beating with cold, absolute certainty. Make it -0. Harrison stared at me for a long moment, the heavy silence of the intensive care unit amplifying the staggering weight of my demand. He did not argue or attempt to temper my absolute fury. He simply nodded slowly, his expression hardening into a chilling mask of pure professional ruthlessness. He packed his reading glasses back into his tailored breast pocket and stood up from the cheap plastic visitor chair. I will have the comprehensive trust framework drafted and completely ready for your execution signature by midnight, he said, his voice dropping into a barely audible whisper. But we cannot securely conduct a sensitive financial operation of this massive magnitude from a heavily monitored hospital bed. You need a highly secure, entirely private location with completely unrestricted network access and absolutely no potential for sudden interruptions. I told him I would personally handle my own medical extraction and explicitly instructed him to meet me at a confidential secondary location. After he quietly slipped back out through the heavy wooden door, deliberately returning to the unmonitored basement utility corridors, I firmly pressed the plastic nurse call button. It took 20 grueling minutes of incredibly aggressive negotiation, 3 forcefully signed legal waivers releasing the entire medical facility from any and all potential liability, and an explicit, unyielding threat to personally purchase the entire cardiac hospital wing just to fire the attending physician to finally process a formal against medical advice discharge. I honestly did not care about the severe physical risk. Lying in that sterile bed, helplessly waiting for my bruised heart to fail, was a pathetic, passive surrender. Taking absolute ruthless control of my sprawling corporate empire, even with painfully bruised ribs and severely strained arteries, was the only genuine medicine my exhausted body actually required right now. At exactly 2 in the morning, the sprawling hospital corridors were dimly lit and hauntingly quiet. The exhausted night shift staff moved sluggishly behind their illuminated counters, paying absolutely no attention to the supposedly dying old man dressed in loose civilian clothes who was walking slowly and deliberately toward the rear service exit. Every single step sent a sharp, agonizing ache radiating deeply through my damaged chest, serving as a brutal physical reminder of the severe medical trauma my aging body had miraculously survived just 36 hours prior. But my focused mind completely pushed the blinding pain aside, heavily fueled by a cold, burning adrenaline that pumped fiercely through my veins. Sarah was already waiting patiently in the dark loading dock alleyway, sitting inside a discreet, heavily tinted black sedan, the powerful engine idling silently in the freezing, bitter Chicago air. I carefully climbed into the leather passenger seat, tightly gripping the plastic dashboard with trembling fingers until my erratic breathing finally stabilized. She did not bother to ask how I was feeling or question my reckless medical decision. She simply reached into the back seat, handed me a fully charged, secured laptop computer, and rapidly pulled away from the dark concrete curb. We drove in complete silence through the deserted city streets, navigating toward a highly private, unlisted loft apartment I secretly owned deep within the industrial district. It was a secure, heavily fortified haven I had quietly purchased several years ago, operating under a completely anonymous shell corporation, designed specifically to serve as a hidden command center for extreme corporate emergencies. Cynthia knew absolutely nothing about this hidden property. Tonight it would serve as the ultimate launching pad for my absolute uncompromising vengeance. Harrison was already waiting impatiently inside the expansive loft when we finally arrived. His leather briefcase opened wide on a large oak dining table, completely surrounded by thick stacks of freshly printed, legally binding documents. For the next 24 exhausting hours, we absolutely did not sleep. We barely even paused to eat, aggressively sustaining ourselves on bitter black coffee and an endless reservoir of sheer, unadulterated willpower. We barely spoke loud enough to hear communicating efficiently and ruthlessly in complex account numbers, international routing codes, massive wire authorizations, and heavily encrypted server passwords. We were rapidly dismantling a massive multi-million-dollar financial fortress, brick by heavy brick, and systematically rebuilding it safely behind completely impenetrable legal walls. First, we aggressively attacked the core corporate structure. Utilizing my legitimate, legally verified digital executive signature, I unilaterally and permanently terminated Brandon's official status as the chief operating officer of my company, permanently stripping his administrative network access and legally nullifying his ability to authorize any future business transactions. I then methodically transferred all 90% of my controlling corporate voting shares directly into a newly established, fully irrevocable blind trust that Harrison had masterfully constructed. That arrogant, aggressive venture capital firm operating out of New York would suddenly wake up on Monday morning to discover that the vulnerable holding company they were actively attempting to purchase no longer legally existed in any recognizable form. The phantom executive authority Brandon had confidently promised to deliver to them was now entirely legally worthless. Next, we aggressively pursued the personal wealth portfolios I had accumulated. I systematically liquidated the conservative mutual funds, the highly lucrative offshore investment accounts, and the massive high-yield dividend portfolios I had carefully curated over 4 decades of tireless labor. Every single dollar, every piece of valuable commercial real estate, and every hidden corporate asset was quietly and swiftly funneled directly into the impenetrable ironclad trust. Harrison drafted the complex legal framework with flawless surgical precision, definitively ensuring that my vast financial assets were completely shielded from any potential future divorce proceedings, aggressive spousal asset claims, or hostile corporate litigation that Cynthia and her treacherous son might attempt to desperately launch. The final devastating step of our relentless operation was arguably the most deeply personal. I slowly logged into the primary joint checking account, the limitless overflowing fountain of personal wealth that Cynthia had been brazenly using to generously fund her lavish celebratory Maui vacation. I sat in the dim light of the secure loft and watched her various pending financial charges processing in real time across the glowing screen. The extraordinarily expensive private yacht rental, the ridiculous designer boutique, purchases, the exorbitant luxury room service bills flowing endlessly from the resort. With a few precise, deliberate keystrokes on the encrypted laptop, I confidently initiated a massive final outbound wire transfer, draining that specific personal account completely and utterly dry. I purposely chose to leave exactly $43.50 remaining in the available daily balance. It was just enough money for a treacherous, ungrateful wife to buy a cheap, highly processed airport lunch on her humiliating journey home, and absolutely nothing more. I calmly closed the heavy laptop screen, the sharp, satisfying metallic click echoing loudly through the otherwise completely silent loft apartment. My damaged chest ached profoundly. My eyes were heavy with a deeply profound exhaustion, but a vast, incredibly satisfying peace finally settled over my weary soul. The intricate financial execution was utterly flawless. The devastating trap was officially legally set. Now I just had to sit back comfortably in the quiet, secure shadows of my hidden safe house and patiently wait for the massive, destructive bomb to finally detonate in paradise. The morning sun slowly began to filter through the heavy industrial blinds of my safe house, casting long, geometric shadows across the oak dining table. Harrison had departed hours ago, leaving me alone with my thoughts, my cold coffee and a completely untraceable burner phone resting on the polished wood. I sat perfectly still, listening to the distant, muffled sounds of the city waking up. In Chicago, it was a crisp, unforgiving Monday morning. But in Maui, it was late Sunday evening, the absolute peak of the luxury dinner hour. I did not have to wait long for the fallout to reach me. At exactly 8:15, the burner phone vibrated, shattering the heavy silence of the loft. It was an automated notification from my secure corporate server alerting me that an emergency voicemail had been deposited into my heavily encrypted private inbox. Brandon and Cynthia had naturally assumed my primary phone was either turned off or sitting uselessly in a hospital locker. They had no idea my communications were automatically forwarded to the secure cloud. I tapped the screen, selected the first audio file and pressed play, letting the digital recording fill the quiet room. The audio began with a cacophony of vibrant background noise. I could hear the gentle crash of ocean waves, the soft, rhythmic strumming of a live acoustic guitar, and the distinct, unmistakable clinking of fine crystal. They were dining at the open-air restaurant of the Four Seasons, a place where the menu did not bother to list the prices. Cynthia's voice came through the speaker first, high-pitched, strained and dripping with an ugly, arrogant indignation. She was not leaving a message for me. She had aggressively dialed the 24-hour concierge line for our private wealth management bank, unaware that Harrison had already routed all high-level account inquiries directly to an automated recording system that forwarded the panicked audio straight to my desk. "Listen to me very carefully," Cynthia hissed into the phone. Her words slightly slurred from what I easily deduced was an excessive amount of expensive alcohol. "I am Cynthia Vales. I am currently sitting at a private oceanfront table attempting to pay for a celebratory dinner, and your incompetent fraud department has completely embarrassed me in front of my family. I need a senior account manager on the line right this second." In the background of the recording, I could clearly hear Brandon laughing, an arrogant, relaxed sound that made my chest ache with fresh anger. I heard him casually tell a waiter to bring another bottle of their finest vintage champagne, a vintage I knew for a fact cost upwards of $500 a bottle. He was celebrating his brilliant corporate coup, completely oblivious to the financial guillotine swinging down toward his neck. "I am waiting!" Cynthia snapped at the automated banking prompt, her patience rapidly disintegrating. My black card was just declined by a 20-year-old waiter. Do you have any idea how humiliating that is? I have an absolute zero limit on this account. You need to remove the travel block immediately. There was a pause in her rant, and I could hear the rustling of fabric, the sound of her digging frantically through her designer handbag. The waiter must have returned to the table because her tone suddenly shifted from entitled rage to a tight, uncomfortable, forced politeness. "Yes, I am speaking with the bank right now," she said, clearly addressing the unseen hotel staff member. "It is simply a routine security measure because we flew in from Chicago yesterday. They are overly cautious with the platinum accounts. Here, just run these alternative cards while I sort out the primary line." I closed my eyes and visualized the exact scene unfolding thousands of miles away. Cynthia draped in silk, trying to maintain her flawless, wealthy facade while handing over a stack of useless plastic. I knew exactly what was going to happen next because I had personally orchestrated the absolute destruction of every single account linked to her name. The audio recording captured the agonizing heavy silence of the next 2 minutes. The live music played cheerfully in the background, a sharp contrast to the suffocating tension slowly wrapping around their dinner table. I heard a chair scrape loudly against the wooden deck. "What do you mean they are all declining?" Brandon demanded, his voice suddenly cutting through the ambient noise. His relaxed, victorious demeanor had vanished instantly. "That is impossible. Try running them again. Run them manually." The waiter, maintaining a rigid professional courtesy, responded quietly. "I apologize, sir, but the terminal is explicitly instructing us to confiscate the cards. The primary institution has issued a hard freeze across the entire banking profile. The hotel manager is currently verifying the status of your penthouse suite reservation, as the original card on file is also reflecting a frozen status." The sheer, unadulterated panic that erupted from my wife was music to my weary ears. A penthouse suite at the Four Seasons, a private yacht charter, and an unlimited tab of premium champagne, all suddenly unsupported by the massive fortune they thought they had successfully stolen. "Brandon, give him your corporate card," Cynthia demanded, her voice climbing into an octave of pure hysteria. "Just put the dinner and the room on the company account until I can get my useless wealth manager on the phone tomorrow morning." I heard the sound of a heavy leather wallet being slapped onto the table. "Just run this one," Brandon ordered the waiter, his tone thick with a forced, desperate bravado. "It is a premium corporate executive account. There are absolutely no spending limits. Run it for the dinner and authorize a $50,000 hold for the penthouse suite to satisfy your manager. Go do it now." I leaned back in my chair, a cold smile touching the corners of my mouth. I had specifically instructed Harrison to liquidate and sever the corporate cards first. I knew Brandon would immediately attempt to lean on the company infrastructure the second his personal finances encountered resistance. The automated recording captured the sound of retreating footsteps, followed by 30 seconds of frantic, hushed arguing between mother and son. "What is going on with the bank?" Tiffany, Brandon's wife, finally spoke up, her voice trembling with confusion. "Why are they taking our cards? Shut up, Tiffany." Brandon snapped viciously. The old man probably forgot to authorize the travel alert before he went into the hospital. "It is just a minor clerical error. It will be fixed by tomorrow." The footsteps returned. The waiter cleared his throat, but this time he was not alone. The deep, authoritative voice of the hotel's night manager echoed clearly through the recording. "Mr. Vales, Mrs. Vales," the manager stated firmly, stripping away the deferential tone they usually reserved for actual paying guests. "We have attempted to authorize the corporate account you provided. It has not simply been declined for a security hold. The issuing bank has permanently flagged the account as closed and deactivated. Furthermore, we have received a direct communication from your corporate headquarters in Chicago, explicitly stating that you are no longer an authorized representative of the company. and that any charges incurred will absolutely not be honored. I listened to the absolute crushing silence that followed the manager's declaration. It was the sound of a stolen empire collapsing into dust. But what the manager said next was the true final strike. Therefore, we must insist on a valid alternative form of payment for the dinner you have consumed this evening. The manager continued, his voice devoid of any sympathy. And regrettably, we must ask you to vacate the penthouse suite immediately, as we cannot allow you to return to the room without a verified deposit. If you cannot provide a valid payment method right now, I will be forced to contact the local authorities to address the outstanding balance. The recording abruptly ended, replaced by the digital beep of the server. I stared at the phone. They had planned to leave me as a forgotten footnote, but I had just stranded them in paradise with absolutely nothing. I sat in the deep leather armchair of my secure penthouse loft, staring at the dark, polished surface of the oak dining table. Outside the expansive windows, the Chicago skyline glittered with cold, indifferent light, a stark contrast to the tropical warmth I had abruptly stripped away from my treacherous wife and stepson. I reached out and gently traced the edge of the untraceable burner phone. For a long, deliberate moment, the device remained completely still. They were currently standing in the lavish lobby of a Hawaiian resort surrounded by towering palm trees, frantically trying to process the sudden catastrophic collapse of their financial reality. I could easily picture Brandon aggressively arguing with the night manager, demanding respect he had never earned, while Cynthia hovered in the background, clutching her worthless platinum cards in absolute disbelief. The physical pain in my chest, a lingering reminder of the massive coronary incident I had survived just days prior, seemed to dull significantly. The sharp thrill of absolute control acted as the perfect anesthetic. I took a slow, deep breath, letting the cool, filtered air fill my healing lungs. I did not have to wait very long for their initial shock to morph into desperate action. The small screen of the phone suddenly illuminated the dark room, casting a pale glow across my hands. It vibrated once, a short, sharp buzz against the wooden table. Then it vibrated again, and again. The barrage had officially commenced. I simply sat back and watched the incoming notifications multiply with rapid, frantic precision. The digital counter on the screen climbed. 10 missed calls, 15 missed calls, 20 missed calls. They were relentlessly dialing the secure proxy number, unaware that their desperate attempts to reach the suite were being seamlessly routed directly to the device resting inches from my fingertips. The sheer volume of incoming calls painted a vivid picture of their escalating panic. By the time the screen finally stopped flashing, the red text indicated exactly 30 missed calls within 14 minutes. They were trapped thousands of miles from home without a single dollar. I picked up the phone, the metal casing feeling grounding in my palm. I bypassed the log and opened the visual voicemail application. There were 5 audio messages waiting. I tapped the screen to play the first recording, turning the volume up so their voices would echo clearly through the empty space of the loft. Cynthia spoke first, her tone dripping with familiar grating arrogance. "Richard," her voice barked through the small speakers, sharp and annoyed. "I do not know what kind of incompetent clerical mistake your accounting department has made, but every single one of my cards has been declined. The hotel manager is being incredibly rude and unreasonable. You need to call the private banking tier immediately and authorize an override. Fix this embarrassing mess right now and tell them to process the charges." The message ended with an aggressive, frustrated sigh. She still firmly believed this was nothing more than a minor administrative glitch. She still genuinely thought she was entirely in control. I smirked in the darkness, swiping my finger across the screen to initiate the second audio file. The second voicemail was left just 3 minutes after the first, but the subtle shift in Cynthia's voice was instantly detectable. The abrasive entitlement was beginning to fracture slowly, giving way to genuine creeping anxiety. "Richard, why are you not answering the emergency proxy line?" she demanded, her breathing noticeably shallow and rapid. "The bank is completely ignoring my security verification codes. They are refusing to speak with me. Brandon tried to use the primary corporate account to cover the dinner and the suite, but the manager just informed us that the account has been permanently closed. Closed, Richard. They said his executive authority has been entirely revoked. What is happening back in Chicago? You need to pick up the phone. You need to handle this right now before they call the local authorities. We cannot even access the room to retrieve our luggage. The recording clicked off, instantly replaced by the third message. This time it was Brandon. His usual slick, confident corporate persona had completely vanished, replaced by the frantic, terrified cadence of a cornered animal. "Dad," he began, his voice shaking with pathetic, desperate urgency. "Dad, I know you are probably resting, but we have a massive crisis here. The resort security staff is physically escorting us out of the lobby. They are threatening to file formal criminal charges for defrauding a hospitality establishment. I tried to contact Vanguard and Hayes to secure an emergency bridge loan, but the legal team there is completely ignoring my emails. Please, you have to call the bank. Just authorize a temporary wire transfer so we can get out of this hotel. I swear we will figure everything out when we get back. Just pick up the damn phone, please." I listened to his pathetic pleading, feeling absolutely no sympathy. He had stood beside my hospital bed, staring at my vulnerable body, and callously orchestrated the complete liquidation of my life's work. He deserved every ounce of the profound terror he was currently experiencing. I let the fourth and fifth voicemails play, allowing the chaotic symphony of their destruction to wash over me. Cynthia was openly weeping in the background of the final recording, loudly begging the hotel staff for mercy, while Brandon frantically shouted at an indifferent security guard. They were utterly stranded in a tropical paradise, entirely stripped of the unearned power and endless financial resources they had arrogantly taken for granted. They had flown to Maui to celebrate a victory that never existed, completely convinced that they had outsmarted a dying man. I placed the phone back down on the heavy oak table. The room was perfectly silent once again. The time for listening was officially over. It was time to deliver the final, definitive strike. I picked up the device, opened the encrypted messaging application, and selected a secure line to Brandon's personal cellular device. I did not want to engage in a drawn-out conversation. I did not want to listen to their pathetic apologies or desperate fabricated lies. I wanted absolute, undeniable finality. My thumbs moved slowly and deliberately across the digital keyboard, crafting a message that would permanently shatter whatever lingering, foolish hope they still harbored. I typed the words with cold, methodical precision, ensuring there was absolutely no room for any misinterpretation. Your vacation just got extended. By the way, Brandon's power of attorney is void. Have a nice life. I stared at the short, devastating text message, feeling the immense weight of the 15 years I had foolishly wasted on a family that only ever valued my bank accounts. They had asked me to completely disappear from their levels, and I was simply granting their incredibly selfish request with absolute ruthless perfection. I did not hesitate. I pressed the send icon. The digital arrow turned a solid blue, clearly indicating that the message had been successfully delivered directly to his phone. I calmly powered down the untraceable device, the glass screen finally fading to a deep, absolute, and permanent black. The loft was completely silent when the sun crested the Chicago skyline on Monday morning. I sat in the leather armchair, nursing a cup of black coffee, feeling the profound satisfaction of a perfectly executed strategy. My physical heart was still healing the dull ache in my chest, a constant reminder of my mortality. But my mind was sharper than it had been in decades. I opened my secured laptop, watching the digital clock in the corner of the screen tick closer to the opening of the New York financial markets. I knew exactly what Brandon would try to do. Desperation breeds predictability. He was stranded in a tropical paradise, evicted from his penthouse, and completely stripped of his corporate safety net. His only remaining lifeline, or so he foolishly believed, was the massive acquisition deal he had been secretly negotiating behind my back. At exactly 9 in the morning, Eastern Standard Time, my encrypted email client chimed softly. A single message had arrived from Sarah Jenkins. The subject line simply read, New York correspondence. Attached to the email was a compressed audio file. Sarah had thoughtfully included a brief note explaining that the managing partner of the venture capital firm, a man named Sterling Vance, had forwarded the recording directly to her office. Upon receiving our aggressive cease and desist letter at dawn, Sterling had instructed his legal compliance team to record all incoming communications from Brandon. He wanted absolute legal immunity from the fraudulent mess my stepson had attempted to orchestrate. I clicked the audio file, leaned back, and let the desperate sounds of Brandon's ultimate defeat fill the quiet room. The recording began with the sharp, hollow ringing of a direct corporate line. When Sterling answered, his voice was crisp, professional, and entirely devoid of warmth. Brandon launched into his pitch immediately, not even bothering with customary pleasantries. His words were rushed, his breathing heavy and erratic. It sounded as though he was pacing furiously on a windy street corner or an open beach. Sterling, he began, his voice laced with a pathetic manufactured confidence. We have a slight operational delay on our end regarding the final acquisition paperwork. My father is currently incapacitated, and the transition of executive power is taking slightly longer than anticipated. However, the deal is still completely solid. I just need you to wire the initial cash advance we discussed last week. A bridge loan just to cover some immediate restructuring expenses on my end. I will personally guarantee the funds against my future equity share once the ink is dry. I took a slow sip of my coffee, savoring the absolute absurdity of his request. He was begging a ruthless Wall Street shark for a personal bailout, using stolen corporate equity as collateral. The silence on the other end of the line was heavy, thick, with the kind of predatory amusement that only seasoned financial veterans truly understand. When Sterling finally spoke, his tone was so remarkably cold it could have frozen the Pacific Ocean. Brandon Sterling said carefully, articulating every single syllable, I am going to stop you right there before you incriminate yourself any further on a recorded line. I do not know what kind of amateur theatrical performance you think you are running, but we are a Tier 1 financial institution, not a payday lending service for stranded tourists. I could hear Brandon stutter, completely caught off guard by the aggressive shift in tone. Sterling, I do not understand, he stammered, the manufactured confidence instantly evaporating. I have the signed medical and financial power of attorney. I have the legal right to liquidate the holding company. We agreed on the 30% acquisition. We shook hands on this. You do not have anything. Brandon Sterling interrupted, his voice dropping into a harsh, unforgiving register. Your chief financial officer, Sarah Jenkins, sent my legal department a massive package at 6 o'clock this morning. It included a comprehensive cease and desist order, a fully verified corporate injunction, and a detailed forensic analysis of your recent activities. Do you have any idea how much liability you just tried to expose my firm to? You attempted to sell us proprietary source code using a blatantly forged document. The signature on your supposedly ironclad proxy is completely invalid. Our restructuring lawyers took one single look at it and laughed. It is utterly worthless. Brandon let out a strangled gasp, the sound of a man watching his only remaining parachute burst into flames. But the holding company, he pleaded, his voice breaking into a high, panicked whine. When he dies, my mother gets the holding company. We can just restructure the deal through her. We can still make this work, Sterling. Just send the advance. I need that cash right now. Sterling let out a dry, humorless chuckle. That was the sound of the final nail being hammered into the coffin. You really have absolutely no idea what is happening. Do you? Sterling asked, his tone shifting from anger to pure, unadulterated pity. There is no holding company anymore, Brandon. Your father spent the entire weekend moving every single corporate asset, every share of stock, and every liquid portfolio into an impenetrable blind trust. He completely dissolved the entity you were trying to sell. There is absolutely nothing left for your mother to inherit, even if he were to pass away this morning. The silence that followed was absolute. I could almost hear the tropical wind blowing through the speaker, carrying the shattered remains of Brandon's ego out to sea. But Sterling was not quite finished. He possessed the vicious instincts of a true corporate predator, and he was determined to leave absolutely no room for misunderstanding. Furthermore, Sterling continued, his voice sharp as a razor blade. I received a formal notice of termination alongside the legal injunction. You do not own 30% of that software empire, Brandon. You do not have executive clearance to authorize a bridge loan. In fact, as of yesterday evening, you do not even work there anymore. You are a terminated employee with a mountain of potential fraud charges hanging over your head. Do not ever contact this firm again. If you call this number one more time, I will personally forward this entire recording to the federal authorities. The line went dead with a sharp, decisive click. The audio file ended, leaving me sitting in the peaceful quiet of my secure loft. I slowly closed the laptop, letting my hands rest on the warm aluminum casing. The trap had not just snapped shut. It had completely obliterated the predators. Brandon had tried to sell my life's work for a quick, unearned payday, and instead he had publicly humiliated himself in front of the very people he desperately wanted to impress. He was entirely stripped of his title, his access, his stolen funds, and his dignity. I stood up and walked over to the floor-to-ceiling windows, looking down at the bustling streets of Chicago. The city was moving, people were going to work entirely unaware of the silent, brutal war that had just been decisively won in the shadows. I thought about Cynthia, Brandon, and Tiffany currently standing in the humid Hawaiian morning air. They had packed their bags, anticipating a permanent life of absolute luxury. They had aggressively ordered premium champagne and chartered private yachts, entirely convinced that they had outsmarted a dying man. Now the brilliant reality of their situation was finally setting in. They were completely stranded on an island in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. Every single credit card they possessed had been permanently deactivated. Their bank accounts were thoroughly drained down to pocket change. They had been formally evicted from their luxury hotel suite, and they did not possess a single shred of corporate or personal authority to secure a loan. They had no money, no shelter, and absolutely no leverage remaining. The luxurious paradise they had sought to claim had instantly transformed into a terrifying, inescapable prison. I smiled gently at the glass pane, wondering exactly how a family so accustomed to private jets and high-class treatment would manage to secure 3 economy tickets back to reality. The answer to my quiet question involved a level of profound degradation that Cynthia and her spoiled son had never experienced in their entire privileged lives. With their designer luggage securely locked inside the hotel storage room, pending a final payment they could not produce, they were unceremoniously escorted off the resort property. They found themselves standing under the brutal Hawaiian sun, wearing the same lightweight resort clothing they had worn to dinner, completely devoid of their usual arrogant armor. Brandon aggressively scrolled through his useless phone contacts, realizing very quickly that his powerful network of corporate allies and affluent friends was entirely built on the wealth I had provided. Without my money, his influence simply evaporated. It was Tiffany who ultimately provided their desperate salvation, though she fought it with every ounce of her superficial being. On her left wrist sat a solid gold Rolex, a lavish anniversary gift I had funded just 2 years ago. The ensuing argument on the hot sidewalk was supposedly spectacular, filled with bitter tears and vicious insults, but absolute desperation eventually won. They walked 2 miles to a local dimly lit pawn shop. Cynthia, a woman who strictly purchased her jewelry from private dealers in Paris and Milan, was forced to stand in a dusty showroom and watch her daughter-in-law slide the magnificent watch across a scratched glass counter. The pawnbroker, a heavily tattooed man, completely unimpressed by their frantic attitude, offered them a pathetic, incredibly humiliating fraction of its actual retail market value. Brandon furiously tried to aggressively negotiate using his arrogant boardroom tactics, but a man sitting behind a pawn shop register absolutely does not care about false corporate posturing. He simply tossed a thick stack of worn $100 bills onto the scratched glass counter, effectively finalizing the very last financial transaction Brandon would ever successfully close that weekend. They used the cash to immediately purchase 3 standard one-way economy tickets on the first available commercial flight back to Chicago. For my wife, a woman who considered flying commercial to be an unacceptable insult, the journey was a psychological nightmare. They were jammed into the very last row of a crowded cabin, seated right next to the noisy lavatory. There was absolutely no elite priority boarding, no complimentary glasses of vintage champagne, and absolutely no respectful, dedicated flight attendants happily catering to their every demanding whim. They were forced to sit upright in stiff, narrow seats for 9 grueling hours, surrounded by crying toddlers and exhausted tourists. Cynthia later complained to a friend that the synthetic fabric of the standard airline blanket gave her a rash, a detail that brought me immense quiet joy. During the long flight, Brandon desperately tried to formulate a counterattack. He whispered fiercely to Tiffany, spinning wild, impossible scenarios where he would hire a ruthless team of aggressive litigators to sue me for breach of contract and severe emotional distress. He genuinely believed that once he returned to his home territory, he could somehow reverse the devastating financial annihilation I had enacted. He failed to comprehend that I had not just closed his bank accounts, I had systematically dismantled the entire foundation of his reality. By the time the massive airplane finally touched down at the international airport, they were physically exhausted, emotionally drained, and shivering uncontrollably. They had foolishly departed tropical paradise wearing thin linen shirts and delicate silk dresses, leaving them completely unprepared for the incredibly biting, unforgiving winter wind, howling violently across the freezing cold Midwestern tarmac. There was no sleek black car waiting for them at the curbside pickup. There was no personal driver rushing to open their doors and offer them heated leather seats. Instead, Brandon was forced to summon a standard rideshare vehicle using the last remaining funds from his personal application account. They huddled together in the back seat of a worn, heavily used sedan, enduring a tense, suffocating silence as the driver navigated the busy highway leading toward the affluent northern suburbs. Cynthia stared blankly out the smudged passenger window, her clenched jaw firmly set in a rigid, terrifying line of pure, unadulterated, blinding fury. She was silently and meticulously calculating the massive multi-million-dollar divorce settlement she planned to aggressively demand, entirely ignorant of the fact that the powerful trust had already shielded every single asset from her greedy grasp. The vehicle finally turned into their exclusive gated neighborhood, rolling slowly past manicured lawns and towering pristine mansions. Brandon sat up straighter, adjusting the collar of his wrinkled linen shirt. The sight of his massive $5 million property seemed to inject a fresh surge of false confidence into his veins. It was a sprawling, magnificent estate of stone and glass, a house I had purchased for them, in full, to ensure my grandchildren would grow up in absolute comfort. He firmly believed that this fortress was his untouchable sanctuary. He truly thought that once he crossed that threshold, he could regroup, hire an aggressive legal team, and drag me through years of painful litigation. The car stopped at the end of the long, circular driveway. Brandon practically leaped from the vehicle, marching up the wide stone steps toward the heavy double doors with his head held high. Cynthia and Tiffany followed closely behind him, shivering violently in the freezing evening air, incredibly eager to step inside the warm, luxurious foyer. Brandon confidently pulled his heavy metal key from his pocket and jammed it into the brass lock. He turned his wrist sharply, fully expecting the familiar, satisfying click of the heavy deadbolt. The key refused to turn. He frowned, jiggling the metal violently, completely convinced that the cold weather had temporarily jammed the delicate internal mechanism. He cursed softly under his frozen breath and angrily pulled the metal key out quickly, stepping over to the highly sophisticated biometric security pad securely mounted on the cold stone wall. He pressed his thumb firmly against the glowing glass sensor. The small digital screen instantly flashed a bright, angry red. Access denied. He tried again, pressing harder, his heart rate spiking as the red light illuminated his panicked face for a second time. Access permanently denied. Cynthia pushed past him furiously, demanding that he enter the manual override code. Brandon quickly typed the numbers with trembling fingers. The system beeped twice, a harsh, unforgiving sound that echoed loudly in the quiet suburban night. The heavy doors remained completely sealed. The sprawling $5 million mansion they considered their absolute property was entirely locked down. As the horrifying reality of their total exclusion began to settle heavily over them, the motion sensor lights on the expansive wraparound porch suddenly flared to life. The brilliant illumination cast long, stark shadows across the manicured landscaping. From the deep, darkened corner of the stone veranda, a tall, imposing figure slowly stepped forward into the harsh light. It was Harrison Cole. My ruthless wealth attorney stood perfectly still, his hands resting casually in the pockets of his expensive wool overcoat. He looked down at Brandon and Cynthia with an expression of cold, professional detachment, waiting patiently for them to fully process the catastrophic end of their privileged existence. Harrison did not move a single muscle as Brandon stared at him in absolute shock. The cold night air whipped across the stone porch, freezing the arrogant breath right inside my stepson. Behind Harrison, stepping smoothly out from the heavy shadows of the manicured security hedges, were two massive men dressed in identical dark suits. They were private security contractors, highly trained, heavily armed, and completely unbothered by the freezing temperature. They took their positions flanking the heavy double doors, crossing their thick arms, and staring blankly at the shivering trio standing on the driveway. Cynthia was the first to finally break the suffocating silence. She wrapped her thin silk shawl tightly around her shaking shoulders and demanded to know what my attorney was doing on her property in the middle of the night. She ordered him to move aside and open the door immediately so she could get out of the freezing wind. She threatened to call the local police and have him arrested for trespassing on her private estate. Harrison simply smiled, a thin, humorless expression that did absolutely nothing to warm his face. He calmly reached inside the inner pocket of his heavy wool overcoat and slowly extracted a thick manila envelope. He held it out toward her, his hand perfectly steady in the bitter cold. The heavy paper seemed to absorb the dim security lighting, acting as a physical anchor for the absolute destruction about to follow. "This property no longer belongs to you, Cynthia," Harrison stated, his deep voice carrying easily over the howling wind. "In fact, as of Friday evening, the title was permanently transferred into a blind corporate trust, an entity over which you possess absolutely no legal authority or marital claim." He stepped down one stone stair and pressed the heavy envelope directly against her shivering chest until she was forced to instinctively grab it. "These are your formal divorce papers, properly filed, fully expedited, and legally binding." Cynthia stared down at the thick stack of premium legal paper, her manicured fingers trembling violently. She tried to muster a laugh, a pathetic, high-pitched sound of pure denial. She loudly proclaimed that a blind trust meant absolutely nothing, that she was legally entitled to exactly half of my sprawling estate, half of the commercial properties, and a massive monthly spousal support package that would sustain her luxurious lifestyle until the day she died. She promised Harrison that her own aggressive legal team would tear his amateur trust apart in a matter of weeks. Harrison buttoned his overcoat against the wind and shook his head with profound professional pity. He calmly reminded her of the ironclad prenuptial agreement she had eagerly signed 15 years ago. He recited the specific penalty clauses from memory, detailing the severe consequences of financial infidelity. He smoothly explained that her active participation in a documented conspiracy to defraud my personal estate, explicitly evidenced by her offshore wire attempts and massive unauthorized credit expenditures while I lay dying in a hospital bed, constituted a total unrecoverable breach of that contract. "You legally forfeit all spousal support," Cynthia Harrison concluded, his tone absolutely merciless. "You are entitled to absolutely zero alimony, zero property division, and zero compensation. You leave this marriage with exactly the clothes currently on your back." Harrison adjusted his pristine collar, ensuring his posture remained impeccably upright. He displayed absolutely no emotion as he silently judged the pathetic woman who had arrogantly attempted to discard a dying man for a lavish tropical vacation. Brandon violently shoved his mother behind him, his face turning a vibrant, dangerous shade of crimson. He began to scream into the freezing night, his voice echoing loudly against the neighboring stone mansions. He demanded to be led inside the house, furiously claiming that he was a victim of an illegal corporate coup. He pointed a shaking finger directly at Harrison and aggressively threatened to sue my software company for millions of dollars in punitive damages. He loudly declared that as the rightful chief operating officer, he held significant equity and unmatched operational authority, and that no obscure legal trickery could magically erase his documented corporate standing. He promised to drag my name through the most vicious, highly publicized corporate litigation the city had ever witnessed. Harrison did not flinch, nor did he raise his voice to match Brandon. He simply reached back into his heavy overcoat and pulled out a second, slightly thinner envelope. He extended his arm, waiting patiently until Brandon finally stopped screaming and snatched the paper from his hand. "You are officially terminated for gross corporate espionage, systemic fraud, and attempted grand larceny," Harrison explained smoothly. "Your executive privileges were permanently revoked 48 hours ago." Brandon ripped the envelope open, his eyes frantically scanning the formal termination letter. He stammered that a termination required board approval, that a dying man could not unilaterally execute a firing of a senior partner. Harrison took a slow, deliberate step forward, completely closing the distance between them. "Richard is very much alive, Brandon," he stated softly. "And he is very, very angry. The district attorney has already been fully notified of your documented attempt to illegally sell protected company assets to a New York venture capital firm. They currently possess the Vanguard and Hayes email threads, the financial wire receipts, and the blatantly forged medical power of attorney you foolishly tried to execute." Tiffany collapsed onto the cold, concrete driveway, burying her face in her hands and sobbing uncontrollably. The devastating reality of their situation was finally crashing down around them with the heavy, inescapable weight of a collapsing building. They were entirely locked out of their magnificent mansion. Their endless bank accounts were completely drained. The luxurious cars sitting inside the heated garage were legally untouchable. The massive software empire they had desperately tried to steal was entirely out of their reach. And worst of all, a highly aggressive criminal investigation was already quietly building against them in the shadows of the city. Harrison looked down at the pathetic, shivering trio standing in the freezing darkness. "I strongly suggest you vacate this private property immediately," Harrison commanded, gesturing slightly toward the two massive security contractors waiting silently on the porch. "If you remain on this driveway for another 60 seconds, these gentlemen are under strict, uncompromising orders to physically detain you and summon the local authorities for criminal trespassing. I do not care where you go, but you can no longer exist here." Cynthia tried to speak, her mouth opening and closing like a suffocated fish, but absolutely no words came out. Brandon dropped the termination letter onto the frozen concrete, his shoulders slumping in total, absolute defeat. They slowly turned around, pulling their thin, useless resort clothing tightly around their shaking bodies, and began the long, humiliating walk down the dark, freezing suburban street. Stuck out in the incredibly bitter cold, with no money, no hotel, no company, and absolutely no wealthy friends willing to cross my path, they had to somehow find a way to survive the night. They had played a dangerous game of greed, and they had definitively lost everything. The silence of the night swallowed them whole. The silence of the freezing suburban night was finally broken by a sound I had never expected to actually hear. Cynthia, a woman whose entire existence was meticulously built upon a foundation of absolute unyielding arrogance, was now completely shattered. Her perfectly curated facade simply dissolved into the biting wind. Her knees buckled beneath her incredibly thin, expensive silk dress, and she collapsed violently onto the hard, frozen concrete driveway. The sheer physical impact of her sudden fall echoed clearly through the high-definition security microphones, but she did not even seem to visually register the intense, agonizing physical pain. She threw her trembling hands forward, grabbing frantically at the hem of Harrison Cole's heavy, incredibly expensive wool winter overcoat. Tears streamed uncontrollably down her impeccably contoured face, completely ruining her dark makeup and leaving tragic streaks across her cheeks. She began to beg me. It was a completely pathetic, breathless stream of absolute desperation pouring from her trembling lips. She pleaded with my attorney to immediately stop this madness, aggressively claiming that this entire ordeal was nothing more than a catastrophic, horrible misunderstanding that could be resolved very quickly. She sobbed that she loved me, that she had always truly loved me, and that her hasty trip to Maui was merely a misguided, desperate attempt to effectively cope with the overwhelming, paralyzing grief of my impending sudden medical demise. She practically swore that if I just gave her one single chance to explain, she could magically make everything right. Harrison did not take a single step backward, nor did he attempt to pull his expensive coat away from her incredibly desperate, clawing grip as she wept on the ground. He simply stood there, an immovable monument of professional apathy, staring down at her with a look of clinical detachment. He allowed her to completely exhaust her freezing lungs, waiting patiently as her hysterical sobs slowly reduced to wheezing gasps. Behind her, Brandon remained entirely frozen in his rigid place. The once arrogant, high-powered corporate executive was now nothing more than a terrified, shivering boy standing in the wind. He offered his weeping mother absolutely no physical assistance whatsoever. He did not reach down to help her stand up. He simply stared blankly at the massive locked wooden doors of the $5 million mansion he previously thought he rightfully owned. Tiffany was huddled tightly against one of the massive stone pillars, weeping silently into her frozen, trembling hands, completely shattered by the instant evaporation of her luxurious lifestyle. They were a vivid portrait of utter comprehensive failure, entirely stripped of the unearned wealth that had previously shielded them from the brutal, unforgiving consequences of their own treacherous actions. I watched this entire pathetic spectacle unfold from the absolute comfort of my secure, luxurious penthouse loft, miles away in the city. The glowing screen of my heavily encrypted laptop displayed a crystal-clear, high-resolution feed from the advanced security cameras I had personally installed around the suburban perimeter. The cameras captured every single agonizing detail of their humiliation. The white frost slowly forming on the extremely expensive leather of their abandoned designer luggage sitting blindly on the pavement. The highly visible, terrified trembling of Brandon's tightly clenched jaw. The pathetic way Cynthia's manicured fingernails scraped helplessly against the hard, frozen driveway as she begged for her stolen life. I sat deeply in my plush leather armchair, completely wrapped in a thick, warm blanket, holding a steaming ceramic mug of bitter black coffee. I took a slow, deliberate sip, letting the rich, dark liquid thoroughly warm my dry throat. I felt absolutely no pity for their sudden, devastating downfall. I felt absolutely no regret for the actions I took. I simply watched the woman who had callously wished for my sudden death kneel on the freezing ground and aggressively beg for my money. Hearing her desperately proclaim love after reading the horrific evidence in Kwangmao 1_21.docx and the subsequent file Kwangmao 2_21.docx only solidified the absolute righteousness of my uncompromising vengeance against my entirely treacherous, greedy family. I placed the warm coffee mug down onto the polished surface of the oak dining table and leaned forward slightly, resting my heavy elbows lightly on my freshly healed knees. I slowly reached out and pressed my index finger firmly against the digital intercom button on the security application interface. A small, bright green light illuminated on my laptop screen, clearly indicating that the two-way audio connection to the massive, hidden outdoor porch speakers was now fully active and broadcasting live. The loud, sudden crackle of sharp electronic static cut violently through the freezing suburban air causing Cynthia to instantly freeze in absolute terror. She slowly lifted her tear-stained face, looking nervously around the empty porch with wide, deeply panicked eyes. Brandon flinched aggressively, instinctively, taking a fearful, uncoordinated step backward, away from the heavily fortified wooden doors. They knew that specific sound. They knew exactly who was silently watching them from the invisible, unyielding shadows of consequence. I leaned much closer to the sensitive laptop microphone, keeping my voice incredibly calm, remarkably steady, and completely devoid of any trace of emotional warmth or lingering sentimental family attachment. You did not want to miss your flight to Hawaii. Cynthia, my voice boomed deeply through the high-fidelity outdoor speakers, echoing loudly across the massive stone veranda and rolling heavily down the long, circular driveway into the winter night. You packed your bags, while my heart monitor was still frantically beeping. You happily planned your lavish tropical celebrations while I was desperately fighting for every single breath I took. Now you do not have to worry about missing anything ever again. The psychological impact of my voice was absolutely and profoundly devastating. Cynthia let out a loud, piercing wail, aggressively covering her ears as if my spoken words were physically burning her skin. Brandon completely collapsed against the cold stone wall, sliding down slowly until he was sitting helplessly on the frozen ground right next to his softly weeping wife. I removed my finger from the digital intercom button, instantly severing the audio connection and plunging the sprawling estate back into the cold, unforgiving silence of the bitter winter. On the digital screen, I watched as Harrison Cole gave a single, almost imperceptible nod to the two massive private security contractors standing silently in the shadows of the porch. The armed men immediately stepped forward, moving with swift, terrifying efficiency. They grabbed Brandon roughly by the arms, hauling him forcefully to his feet, and gestured aggressively for Cynthia, Tiffany, to immediately follow. There was absolutely no room for any negotiation. There was absolutely no delay. The imposing guards marched the weeping, completely broken family down the long, winding driveway, physically escorting them all the way past the ornate iron gates that marked the absolute edge of the private property line. The heavy metal gates slowly swung shut behind them, locking with a loud, definitive, and permanent mechanical clatter. They were left standing entirely alone on the dark, freezing suburban sidewalk, clutching their thin resort clothing, shivering violently beside their entirely useless designer suitcases, permanently banished from my world. Exactly 30 days after that freezing night on the driveway, I walked through the towering glass doors of my corporate headquarters. The morning sun illuminated the expansive marble lobby, reflecting brightly off the polished surfaces and casting a warm golden glow over the bustling space. My physical recovery had been nothing short of miraculous. The dull ache in my chest had faded into a distant memory, replaced by a deep, resonant vitality that I had not felt in over a decade. I did not require a cane, nor did I need to pause for breath as I approached the private executive elevator. My mind was incredibly sharp, operating with a lethal, focused clarity that only surviving a profound betrayal can truly forge. The dedicated security personnel and administrative staff smiled warmly as I passed their eyes, reflecting genuine relief and profound respect. They had all witnessed the chaotic, sudden departure of my treacherous stepson, and they knew the rightful architect of the company had fully returned to his throne. The heavy elevator doors slid open, delivering me directly to the top floor. I walked down the silent, carpeted hallway and stepped into my massive corner office. The panoramic view of the Chicago skyline was absolutely breathtaking, a sprawling testament to the relentless ambition and sheer determination that had built this empire from a freezing concrete garage. I sat down behind my wide mahogany desk, resting my hands firmly on the smooth wood. The air in the room felt remarkably clean, completely purged of the toxic, arrogant energy Brandon had infected it with during my brief medical absence. I took a slow, deep breath, savoring the profound silence of absolute control. I reached over to the secure phone console and pressed the intercom button. I asked my executive assistant to locate Sarah Jenkins and send her to my office immediately. Less than 5 minutes later, the heavy wooden door swung open. Sarah stepped inside carrying her usual stack of financial ledgers and analytical reports. She looked tired but incredibly sharp, her eyes carrying the same unyielding grit that had helped us navigate the treacherous corporate battlefield for years. She sat down in the leather chair opposite my desk, placing her documents on the polished wood. She began to brief me on the latest quarterly projections, rapidly listing off complex data points and international revenue streams. I raised my right hand gently, signaling for her to stop. "I did not call you up here to discuss the quarterly margins, Sarah," I stated calmly, my voice carrying a deep, resonant warmth. "I called you here to discuss the permanent future of this company." I leaned forward, folding my hands together on the desk. When I was lying completely helpless in that intensive care unit surrounded by people who were actively plotting my immediate demise, you were the only person who possessed the courage and the loyalty to stand by my side. You risked your entire professional career to smuggle those documents into my room. You saved my life and you saved the legacy we built together. Sarah lowered her eyes, a rare display of quiet emotion washing over her face. "It was the only acceptable course of action, Richard," she replied softly. "I could never let them destroy what you created." I smiled, a genuine expression of profound gratitude. "I know," I said, "and that is exactly why I am officially terminating your current position as Chief Financial Officer." I slid a heavy embossed leather folder across the desk. "Effective immediately, you are the new Chief Operating Officer of this corporation. You have full executive authority, complete board voting rights, and a significantly expanded equity stake." Sarah stared at the leather folder, completely stunned by the magnitude of the promotion. It was a position she had rightfully earned a dozen times over a position Brandon had shamelessly occupied through nepotism alone. She slowly opened the cover, reading the formal executive decree. I watched the realization settle over her, a beautiful mixture of professional pride and immense relief. "We have a massive amount of work to do, Sarah," I continued, my tone shifting back into a focused, commanding rhythm. "We are going to aggressively expand our logistics network, and I need a truly lethal operational commander to lead the charge." "Are you ready to go to war?" Sarah closed the folder, sitting up perfectly straight. Her eyes locked onto mine, burning with fierce, unstoppable determination. "I am absolutely ready," she declared, her voice steady and powerful. We spent the next 3 hours mapping out a comprehensive, highly aggressive corporate strategy, entirely reshaping the company hierarchy and permanently purging every single useless executive Brandon had foolishly hired during his arrogant tenure. Once she finally departed my office to execute our new directives, I requested another essential meeting. Harrison Cole arrived shortly after lunch, carrying his signature leather briefcase and wearing his usual expression of cold, professional detachment. We had a different kind of restructuring to finalize. I instructed him to completely dissolve my previous last will and testament, systematically erasing every single mention of Cynthia Brandon and Tiffany from the binding legal text. "I refuse to leave a single dollar to pure, unadulterated greed," I explained to my attorney as he quickly drafted the new legal parameters. I directed Harrison to establish a massive, highly structured philanthropic trust. The vast majority of my personal liquid wealth, totaling hundreds of millions of dollars, would be permanently dedicated to funding advanced medical research facilities and comprehensive educational scholarships for underprivileged students across the city. Furthermore, I legally mandated that the remaining substantial corporate equity would be evenly divided among the incredibly loyal, dedicated employees who had faithfully stood by my side during the darkest, most challenging years of my business. The mechanics working in the distribution centers, the software engineers writing code through the night, the administrative staff who kept the machine running. They were my true family, and they would rightfully inherit the massive fruits of our collective, tireless labor. Harrison recorded every instruction with flawless precision, legally fortifying the new documents against any potential future challenges. By the time he packed his briefcase and offered a respectful nod of departure, my legacy was entirely secure, forever shielded from the destructive, grasping hands of entitled parasites. As the late afternoon sun began to dip below the towering city skyscrapers, casting long, dramatic shadows across my office, my private cellular phone vibrated softly on the desk. It was a highly encrypted message from Robert Sanchez, the elite private investigator I had retained to quietly monitor the ensuing fallout. I opened the detailed digital report, reading the final definitive chapter of my vengeance. The sheer magnitude of their profound misery was meticulously documented in stark, undeniable facts. Brandon was currently sitting in a small, windowless interrogation room at the federal courthouse. The district attorney had formally indicted him on multiple highly severe counts of aggressive wire fraud, grand larceny, and corporate espionage. The New York venture capital firm, utterly terrified of potential legal implication, had eagerly handed over every single recorded telephone conversation and forged document to the aggressive federal prosecutors. He was facing a mandatory minimum sentence of 15 grueling years in a federal penitentiary, and without access to my immense wealth, he was forced to rely on an incredibly overworked, profoundly exhausted public defender. His arrogant, high-class life was officially and permanently over. The second half of the detailed investigative report focused entirely on Cynthia, the woman who had callously demanded I disappear from her life, the woman who had spent decades arrogantly parading through elite country clubs and exclusive designer boutiques, was now completely and utterly destitute. The incredibly harsh reality of her violated prenuptial agreement had left her with absolutely nothing but the clothes she had managed to carry off the freezing suburban sidewalk. According to the investigators' precise observations, she was currently residing in a tiny, incredibly dilapidated studio apartment located in a highly undesirable, noisy neighborhood on the far outskirts of the city. To afford the meager monthly rent, she had been brutally forced to accept a humiliating entry-level position as a retail checkout clerk at a depressing, brightly lit discount strip mall. The comprehensive report explicitly detailed how she spent her long, agonizing days standing for 8 hours behind a cheap plastic counter, bitterly scanning discounted merchandise for impatient, rude customers while wearing a hideous, oversized polyester uniform. I closed the investigative report and carefully set the phone down on the smooth mahogany wood. I pictured Cynthia deeply exhausted, her feet throbbing in cheap shoes, desperately trying to maintain a shred of her former dignity, while bagging clearance items under the harsh, buzzing fluorescent lights. I pictured Brandon terrified and completely isolated in a cold, concrete cell, finally realizing that his pathetic, manufactured corporate facade could not save him from the brutal, crushing weight of federal justice. They had eagerly anticipated my death, treating my impending demise as a convenient, lucrative transaction. They had severely underestimated the terrifying resilience of the man who had built their luxurious world. I walked over to the massive glass window, looking down at the vibrant, glowing city below. My heart beat with a steady, powerful, and incredibly peaceful rhythm. The sprawling empire was safe, my legacy was permanently secured and absolute. Uncompromising justice had been served cold. I remained standing by the massive floor-to-ceiling window, allowing the profound silence of the executive suite to wash over me. The sprawling Chicago skyline stretched out before my eyes, a breathtaking expanse of steel glass and relentless ambition. Below me, millions of tiny lights began to ignite as the late afternoon sun gracefully surrendered to the approaching twilight. The city was a massive breathing machine, constantly moving, constantly evolving, entirely indifferent to the petty dramas of those who failed to keep pace. I placed my right hand flat against the cool, thick glass, feeling a deep, powerful resonance vibrating within my own chest. There were absolutely no tears falling from my eyes, and there was not a single ounce of regret lingering in my soul. For years, I had foolishly believed that providing endless luxury was the ultimate expression of love. I had meticulously built a fortress of unparalleled wealth, blindly ignoring the fact that I was actually breeding entitlement, resentment, and profound treachery within my own home. I had willingly invited parasites to feast at my table, completely oblivious to the venom they were secretly pouring into my cup. I slowly traced the faint reflection of my face in the glass, studying the new lines of resilience etched deeply around my eyes. The massive heart attack that had violently struck me down just months ago was supposed to be the tragic end of my story. The doctors had whispered in hushed, pessimistic tones about my highly uncertain survival, while my treacherous family had immediately started counting their unearned inheritance. But looking back now, with the extraordinary benefit of absolute clarity, I fully realized that the agonizing failure of my physical heart had not been a curse. It was, in fact, the greatest blessing I could have ever received. That terrifying medical crisis did not kill me. It brilliantly saved my life. It violently tore away the heavy, suffocating blindfold I had worn for decades. The agonizing pain radiating through my chest that fateful evening was simply the necessary price of admission to finally see the unvarnished, horrifying truth. If my heart had remained perfectly healthy, I would have tragically died a slow, miserable death by 1,000 quiet betrayals. I would have continued to blindly fund Brandon's arrogant corporate failures and Cynthia's hollow, superficial vanity. Instead, the universe had granted me a rare, brutally honest second chance. I had been given the unprecedented opportunity to observe my own funeral while still drawing breath. I was allowed to witness exactly who remained loyal and who instantly transformed into a scavenging vulture the moment they believed I was a defenseless corpse. Excising Cynthia and Brandon from my existence had initially felt like a highly dangerous, incredibly painful surgical procedure. They were deeply embedded infections clinging fiercely to the healthy tissue of my hard-earned empire. But now, with the toxic elements permanently removed, the incredible healing process was accelerating at a remarkable pace. The stifling atmosphere of deceit and manipulation that had quietly poisoned my life was entirely gone. I no longer had to constantly decipher hidden motives or politely tolerate their endless greedy demands. I was completely unburdened, beautifully liberated from the heavy, invisible chains of manufactured family obligation. The profound sense of empowerment flowing through my veins was incredibly intoxicating. I had faced the ultimate betrayal orchestrated by the people sleeping under my own roof, and I had absolutely crushed them with nothing more than raw intelligence and uncompromising patience. The magnificent corporate machine I had sacrificed my entire life to build was now running smoother and more efficiently than ever before. With Sarah Jenkins firmly established as the new chief operating officer, the executive suite was finally filled with genuine razor-sharp competence instead of pathetic, unearned arrogance. She was actively transforming my strategic visions into highly profitable realities, guiding the company toward unprecedented international expansion. Furthermore, the massive, highly structured philanthropic trusts I had recently established were already beginning to funnel millions of dollars into groundbreaking medical research and vital community development. My legacy was no longer a stagnant pool of hoarded wealth, waiting to be recklessly squandered by ungrateful heirs. It was a dynamic living force for monumental good. I had successfully redirected the incredible financial power of my lifetime achievements to support the brilliant, dedicated individuals who actually possessed the profound work ethic to make a meaningful difference in the world. The exceptionally loyal employees who had faithfully stood by me during the darkest hours of my corporate battles were now officially recognized as the true stakeholders of my magnificent empire. They would reap the generous rewards of our collective struggle. I turned away from the sprawling city view and slowly walked across the spacious office toward a small, elegant mahogany cabinet. I opened the polished wooden door and retrieved a heavy crystal tumbler and a bottle of remarkably rare decades-old scotch. I poured a very modest measure of the rich amber liquid, enjoying the soft, satisfying clinking sound it made against the heavy glass. This was a private celebration of profound survival, a quiet toast to the undeniable mastery of my own fate. I had not allowed myself to become a tragic, forgotten victim in my own life story. I had refused to quietly fade into the miserable shadows, while treacherous scavengers violently dismantled my entire kingdom. Instead, I had aggressively reclaimed my absolute power, utilizing the full, terrifying weight of my vast resources to enforce a brutal, uncompromising standard of justice. I held the crystal tumbler up to the ambient light of the room, watching the amber liquid catch the brilliant reflections of the city below. I was a man entirely reborn from the cold ashes of absolute betrayal, hardened by the undeniable reality of human greed. I took a very slow, appreciative sip. The complex, smoky flavor of the aged scotch warmed the back of my throat, offering a rich, deeply satisfying contrast to the icy, calculated vengeance I had so meticulously executed over the past month. My mind drifted briefly back to the shivering, pathetic figures of my former family, standing helplessly on that freezing suburban sidewalk. I felt a fleeting, almost imperceptible whisper of memory regarding the woman I once thought I loved, but it instantly vanished, completely eradicated by the harsh, brilliant illumination of undeniable truth. They were currently navigating the incredibly grim, punishing reality of their self-inflicted destruction, while I remained firmly entrenched at the absolute pinnacle of my magnificent world. The sprawling metropolis outside my window continued to pulse with vibrant electric energy, completely unaware of the silent, brutal war that had been decisively waged and undeniably won within its towering steel borders. I slowly walked back over to the expansive, crystal-clear glass, resting my hand heavily against the solid window pane one final remarkably peaceful time. The dark, endless sky above Chicago was perfectly clear, beautifully adorned with brilliant, shining stars that pierced through the deep, quiet night. I am Richard Vance, the undisputed, unchallenged master of this magnificent corporate empire, and my brand new life, completely free of any toxic shadows, is finally beautifully and absolutely, gloriously mine forevermore. The cool glass of this window remained smooth beneath my palm as I finally turned my back on the sprawling Chicago skyline. The quiet hum of the city faded into the background, completely replaced by the profound tranquility of my isolated penthouse loft. I walked slowly across the wide expanse of the room, my footsteps entirely silent against the thick premium carpets that lined the floor. The heavy burdens that had suffocated my spirit for so many decades were now completely eradicated. I moved with a newly discovered lightness, a physical manifestation of the immense emotional relief coursing through my veins. Every single corner of this massive space felt entirely different now. It no longer represented a fragile sanctuary from a treacherous family, but rather a permanent fortress of solitude and absolute victory. I approached the elegant marble island situated in the center of my modern kitchen. The ambient lighting above cast a warm, inviting glow over the polished stone surface. I placed my heavy crystal tumbler down, watching the remaining amber liquid settle perfectly still. There was no rush anymore. There were absolutely no urgent demands echoing from greedy dependents, and no manipulative pleas seeking to drain my hard-earned resources. The evening belonged entirely to me, stretching out as a vast, uninterrupted canvas of limitless potential. I reached up with my right hand and slowly unbuttoned the stiff collar of my tailored dress shirt, allowing the incredibly soft, breathable cotton fabric to loosen comfortably around my neck. The simple, deliberate act of removing my formal business attire felt remarkably symbolic. It was the physical shedding of my rigid defensive armor. I had successfully survived the brutal corporate battlefield and the highly toxic domestic war, and I had absolutely decimated my enemies on both fronts. As I pulled my left hand away from my collar, the bright overhead lighting caught the dull, metallic gleam of the thick gold band resting heavily on my ring finger. It was my wedding ring. I paused, holding my hand up to the light, staring intently at the smooth, circular piece of jewelry that had bound me to Cynthia for so many years. It was a tangible symbol of a vow I had honored with absolute, unwavering fidelity, a vow she had treated with casual, heartbreaking contempt. She had eagerly worn her corresponding diamond ring, while simultaneously plotting my demise and counting my vast wealth from a luxurious beach resort. I slowly wrapped the fingers of my right hand around the heavy gold band. It felt remarkably cold against my warm skin, completely devoid of any lingering sentimental value. I did not feel a single trace of sorrow, nor did I experience any sudden rush of nostalgic mourning. The profound love I had once harbored for that incredibly treacherous woman had been entirely extinguished, permanently snuffed out by the sheer, undeniable magnitude of her calculated cruelty. With a firm, steady motion, I pulled the heavy gold ring completely off my finger. It slid effortlessly over my knuckle, leaving behind a faint, pale indentation on my skin. I stood completely still for a long moment, holding the discarded jewelry tightly in my palm, feeling the satisfying weight of my final, ultimate liberation. I turned slowly and walked over to the stainless steel waste receptacle, discreetly positioned beneath the marble counter. I did not hesitate. I did not offer any silent prayers or poetic farewells. I simply opened my hand and let the heavy gold ring fall directly into the dark, empty bin. The metallic clatter echoed sharply against the quiet walls, a highly definitive, deeply satisfying punctuation mark, ending a miserable chapter of my life. I closed the sleek cabinet door, completely detaching my soul from the toxic, exhausting past. The pale indentation on my finger would eventually fade, just as the memory of their pathetic greed would slowly dissolve into the endless river of time. I walked back toward the expansive living area, feeling a deep, powerful surge of absolute control settling firmly into my bones. The massive leather armchair awaited me, positioned perfectly to offer an unobstructed view of the vibrant, glowing metropolis outside. I sank comfortably into the incredibly soft cushions, letting my head rest back against the premium leather. I reached over to the small, polished side table and picked up a thick, leather-bound book. It was a complex historical biography I had been eagerly wanting to read for several months, completely unable to find the required mental focus while navigating the chaotic demands of my former family. Now my mind was entirely my own. I opened the book, the crisp sound of the turning pages breaking the beautiful, heavy silence of the room. The words on the page were clear, sharp, and deeply engaging. I was no longer an exhausted, dying man desperately trying to secure an unappreciative legacy. I was a remarkably healthy, incredibly wealthy, and absolutely uncompromising force of nature. I had meticulously restructured my sprawling corporate empire to reward the genuinely loyal individuals who actually deserved it. I had permanently legally protected my massive financial assets from those who callously viewed my existence as nothing more than an inconvenient obstacle to their luxurious desires. The air in the penthouse felt incredibly pure, completely washed clean of deception and entitlement. The terrible, suffocating pressure in my chest that had once signaled my impending death was entirely gone, replaced by the steady, powerful rhythm of a completely revitalized heart. The relentless, ambitious machine I had built was currently operating at peak efficiency, generating immense prosperity that would now be utilized to profoundly benefit the greater good. The parasites who had actively sought to drain my life force were currently navigating the incredibly grim, unforgiving reality of their own treacherous actions, entirely stripped of the unearned luxury they had foolishly taken for granted. I gently turned another crisp page of my book, savoring the absolute perfect peace of the moment. The quiet evening stretched before me, a beautiful, undeniable testament to the extraordinary power of survival and the cold, unyielding beauty of absolute justice. I was the lone, undisputed author of my future, entirely ready to embrace the glorious, unwritten pages of my remarkably quiet, beautifully victorious new life. It was a magnificent masterpiece of my own deliberate creation. Some people do not love you. They only love the comfortable lifestyle that your sweat, blood, and sacrifices provide for them. When you are strong and providing, you are their king. But the moment you show weakness or become a burden, They will not hesitate to leave you behind to protect their luxury. Never ignore your gut feeling, and never give anyone the power to write your final chapter. True wealth is not just about the money you accumulate. It is about having the ruthless courage to walk away from anyone who views your existence merely as a financial transaction. Please hit that like button if you truly believe betrayal should always be met with cold, hard justice. Subscribe to the channel for more raw, unapologetic life stories. Drop a comment below to tell me where you are watching from today and what you would have done in my shoes.